I'm sorry, we had to stop. We can watch it maybe later. Hey, good morning. If we haven't had a chance to meet yet, my name's Gary. I'm one of the pastors here. Welcome to the meeting place. That scene was from one of the all-time classics. It's right up there with Wizard of Oz, The Ten Commandments, starring a very young-looking Charlton Heston, who played the role of Moses. It came out long before I was born, 1956. The movie recreates arguably one of the best-known stories in the Bible, the Exodus story. The story of God freeing his people who were enslaved by one of the most powerful nations on earth at the time, Egypt. And what makes this story so great and so timeless is because it's a story of redemption. I mean, who doesn't like a story of redemption? I mean, look at the Taken series with Liam Neeson, the Mel Gibson movie Ransom, or the Shawshank Redemption, probably one of the best movies to date. I mean, everyone loves a story of people being freed from prison who have been wrongfully accused or taken against their will. Redemption, by definition, is the action of saving or being saved from sin, error, or evil. And that's what the story of Exodus, found in the second book of the Bible, is all about. But this story actually begins in the first book of the Bible, the book called Genesis, where we're introduced to a guy named Abraham. And one day, Abraham is approached by God, and God says to him, he says, "You know what, Abraham, I know you don't have any kids, and you're kind of getting on in age, and you and your wife want kids, but it hasn't happened yet, but I'm going to make a promise to you. You're going to have a child. You're going to have a son. And that is going to be the beginning of what is going to be a great nation. And through that nation, I'm going to bring redemption to the entire world." And so Abraham, after a whole bunch of years, ends up having a son named Isaac. And Isaac has two sons named Jacob and Esau. Jacob has 12 sons of his own, one of whom is named Joseph. Joseph grew up in a household where he was favored by his dad. He's kind of a daddy's boy. And he was hated by his jealous older brothers. Now, to make matters worse, we all know what sibling rivalry can be like. Well, not only did Joseph come across as daddy's favorite, he had these dreams where he dreamt that he would one day have his brothers bow before him. He would be like their ruler, and he would share these dreams with them. And they're kind of looking at him going, "You're pretty arrogant." And so they concoct this plan to get him out of the picture. And one day they go out in the fields and they're tending their flocks, and the brothers all get together. They beat their brother up, they throw him into a hole in the ground and sell him into slavery. And to make their dad think he's dead, they grab his technicolored coat, the play technicolored dream coat. They grab it and it's all got animal blood on it, and they say he was attacked by an animal. And his dad's all sad, but he's actually in Egypt as a slave. And while he's there, Joseph gets thrown into prison for something he didn't even do. And for years, he sits there in an Egyptian prison. And then he gets released through a series of miraculous events. He gets redeemed from prison. And after being freed, Joseph becomes the right-hand man of the king of Egypt, a guy called Pharaoh. And with his newfound influence and power, Joseph is able to save his family, redeem his family from their homeland that's suffering this massive famine. There's no food. And he brings them in and takes them under his care and protection, kind of like the dream said. And there they thrive, just as God promises. And the people begin to multiply and grow in number. Time passes on, and unfortunately so do the king at the time and Joseph and all of his brothers. And many years pass, and then one day a new king comes to power in Egypt. And he doesn't even know who Joseph is. But he looks around, and he's shocked at what he sees. He says, "Look, the people of Israel now outnumber us and are stronger than we are. We must make plans to keep them from growing even more. If we don't and war breaks out, they will join our enemies and fight against us. They will escape from the country." So the Egyptians made the Israelites their slaves. They appointed brutal slave drivers over them, hoping to wear them down with crushing labor. They forced them to build the cities of Pithom and Ramses as supply centers for the king. But the more the Egyptians oppressed them, the more the Israelites multiplied and spread, and the more alarmed the Egyptians became. So the Egyptians worked the people of Israel without mercy. They made their lives bitter, forcing them to mix mortar and make bricks and do all the work in the fields. They were ruthless in all their demands. What a great definition for a slave. Someone who is used ruthlessly by someone else or something else. Years passed and the king of Egypt died. But the Israelites continued to groan under their burden of slavery. And they cried out for help. And their cry rose up to God. God heard their groaning. And he remembered his covenant promise to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. The promise to make them a great nation and to bring redemption to the world through them. And he, God, looked down on the people of Israel and knew it was time to act. And so God chooses this really unlikely person in Egypt to redeem his people, to set the Hebrew people free, a guy named Moses. Moses was born a Hebrew, an Israelite, but he was raised an Egyptian by Pharaoh's daughter. So he walked like an Egyptian, talked like an Egyptian, but he wasn't an Egyptian. And for the first 40 years of his life, he had it made. He was living in the palace. He didn't want for anything. Anything he wanted, he could get. But one day, he decides to go out and see what life is like for his fellow people. And he heads out, and he doesn't like what he sees. He sees his fellow countrymen being worked ruthlessly. And he actually witnesses an Egyptian slave master beating one of his people. And so Moses waits for the right opportunity. And as this slave master is making his way home, Moses jumps him, beats him up, and actually kills him. To cover up what he's done, he buries him in the sand. But a little while later, thinking he's got away with it, a couple of Hebrew slaves come up to him and say, "Hey, just so you know, we saw what you did." Freaked out that his stepdad, the Pharaoh, might find out, Moses takes off, and he heads for the hills. And he ends up running into a bunch of shepherds, this nomadic family, and who take him in and they give him a job tending sheep. And for the next 40 years, Moses tends sheep, kind of minding his own business. He's kind of settled into this new life. And then one day, God shows up. And he says to Moses, "Look, the cry of the people of Israel has reached me, and I have seen how harshly the Egyptians abuse them. Now go, for I am sending you to Pharaoh. You must lead my people Israel out of Egypt." If you read this story, Moses gets in an arm wrestling match with God, saying, "Don't send me. I'm not the guy. I can't speak well. I kind of stutter over my words." And God's just like, "You're the guy. You're the guy." And he's like, "I'm not the guy. I'm not the guy. You're the guy. You're the guy." Finally, Moses says, "Okay, I'll go." And he goes back to his people that he's not really that connected to. And he lets them know that God has heard their cries. And he's going to set them free. And not only that, he's going to deliver them to this land that's rich in natural resources and fertile land and water. We talked a bit about that last week. Good news, right? Listen to how they respond. Moses told the people of Israel what the Lord had said, that I'm going to set you free, deliver you, redeem you. But they did not listen to Moses because of their broken spirit and their harsh slavery. Seems like a strange response, doesn't it? I mean, these people have been crying out, desperate to be released from a life of slavery. And when word comes that the redemption that they've been hoping for, calling for, pleading for, is finally going to happen, they don't and can't believe it because their spirit is broken. The question is why? Why would their spirit be broken? Just think about their circumstances for a second. They have been enslaved for over 400 years. To put that into context for us, that would be like you and I being enslaved since the 1700s. Before slavery was even abolished in Britain, or before the settlers to the U.S. created their Constitution. 20 generations they've been enslaved. And through it all, they've been calling, crying, pleading for God to help. And nothing changes. Their circumstances stay the same. They're still enslaved. Life is hard. And even though they have been told that God has heard them and was concerned about them and cares about them, they're still waiting for Him to do something. They're like, God, if you're going to do something, now would be a good time. Or are you even there? Do you care? Because you know what? It sure doesn't seem like you do. Their spirit is broken. And maybe that describes you. Now, maybe you're here and you've been begging, pleading, crying out to God to help you out of whatever it is you find yourself in, whatever's got a hold of you. And yet that thing, that situation, that addiction, that relationship still has a hold on you. Nothing has changed. Your circumstances are still the same. Now you're confused, disillusioned. Your spirit is broken. You've given up hope. You just find it hard to believe that there is a God that cares. And how could a God that cares not do anything? I want to share with you a really encouraging part of this story that has helped me, continues to help me through those times when it seems as though God is not answering my prayer, like He just seems absent or distant. Earlier, when we read how the Hebrew people cried out to God, that happens in the 2nd chapter of this book, right at the end of it. But something happens at the beginning of chapter 2. A little story. And it's really easy to read and just kind of, oh, that's kind of cool, and just keep moving on. The chapter starts with us being told of this Hebrew woman giving birth to a son. And for the first 3 months of his life, she has to keep him hidden. And the reason is because the Pharaoh that we read about earlier, the one that was freaking out about how these Israelite people were multiplying, had put out an order that any Hebrew male child born was to be thrown in the Nile River. It was like genocide. He was just trying to wipe these people out. And so she hid him for 3 months, as long as she could possibly hide him. And when it becomes too dangerous for her to hide him anymore, she places him in a basket amongst a bunch of reeds along the shoreline of the Nile River. And this little baby boy's older sister watches to see what happens. And soon Pharaoh's daughter came to bathe in the river. And her attendants walked along the riverbank. And when the princess saw the basket among the reeds, she sent her maid to get it for her. And when the princess opened it, she saw the baby. The little boy was crying, and she felt sorry for him. "This must be one of the Hebrew children," she said. Then the baby's sister approached the princess. "Should I go and find one of the Hebrew women to nurse the baby for you?" "Yes, do," the princess replied. So the girl went and called the baby's mother. "Take this baby and nurse him for me," the princess told the baby's mother. "I will pay you for your help." So the woman took her baby home and nursed him. Later, when the boy was older, his mother brought him back to Pharaoh's daughter, who adopted him as her own son. the princess named him Moses. God was already at work, providing these people with the very thing they needed. Someone to lead them to freedom. And he did it before they even asked for it. This story shows what I have found to be true in my own life. That God does care, God does hear, and he is at work, writing us into his story. You see, oftentimes we think we write God into our story, but it's the other way around. He writes us into his. He's got this all mapped out, but sometimes we can't see it. Moses, after delivering this message to the people that you're going to be saved, God is going to set you free, he finds himself in a back and forth battle with the Pharaoh at the time. And finally, Pharaoh gives in. He just says, fine, you know what? Get your people and get out of here. And so they do. Some theologians figure there was around 3 million of them at the time. 3 million men, women, and children. And so they pack up and they head off into the desert, where they wander for a while and they find themselves up against the Red Sea. And there's nowhere to go. And that's when they hear and feel the rumble of thousands of horses and chariots bearing down on them. You see, unknown to them, shortly after they had left town, Pharaoh changed his mind. And he decided to bring them back into slavery. And so he gathered all his men and chased them down so he could bring them back as slaves. I don't know about you, but have you ever felt chased down by something that you thought you were set free from? For me, it was smoking. I smoked for years. I knew the perils of smoking. My daughters told me all the time, Dad, quit smoking. Yeah. And so I would resolve to take my last drag, smoke my last cigarette, sure that this time would be the time that I would slay the dragon of nicotine once and for all. And there were times I would go weeks, even months, without smoking. And then out of nowhere, I'd find myself in a situation where I was up against it. And the dragon that I thought I had slayed would come rushing back and sink its hooks back into me, drag me back into slavery, and I'd be smoking again. Maybe you share a similar story. You've overcome and been set free from a bad habit, an addiction, some recurring sin in your life. And the next thing you know, it's come up out of nowhere and it's threatening to overtake you and drag you back into that slavery. That's what's happening here. These people are being chased down by the most brutal, efficient army at the time to be dragged back into slavery. And so they begin to panic. And they're freaking out. Understandably so, because just as an addiction can seem so powerful to us when we're trying to overcome it and defeat it, so too does this Egyptian army to them. It's like we don't stand a chance. Now, the Bible doesn't say, but I'm sure there were those that were there that say, we got to fight this. I am not going back into slavery. Let's fight. And I'm sure there were those that said, let's just make a run for it and see what happens. Maybe we'll get lucky. But a majority of them, they wanted to just give in. Go back to what they knew. Go back to slavery. So imagine their surprise when Moses says this. And amongst all that fear, do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance of the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. And then he says this, you need only stand still. You need only stand still. I find so much encouragement in that verse because it's a huge reminder for me that my redemption, my delivery from slavery, is not based on something I do. The thing that sets me free, that sets you free, that sets all of us free is grace. The unmerited, unearned favor of God. It's the beautiful thing about grace. You can't buy it, you can't earn it, you can't barter for it. It's just given to you freely, even though you don't deserve it. Love these words from the New Testament, written to some first century Christians that were kind of struggling with this whole thing. Listen to these words. It says, if you're a hard worker and do a good job, you deserve your pay. We don't call your wages a gift. But if you see that the job is too big for you, that it's something only God can do, and you trust Him to do it, you could never do it for yourself, no matter how hard and how long you worked, well, that trusting in Him to do it is what gets you set right with God, by God. Sheer gift. A little later on, another similar passage is written to some other first century Christians struggling with this. It says, for it is by grace you have been saved, through faith. And this is not from yourselves, it is the gift of God, so that no one can boast. The Lord will fight for you. You only need be still. There's a popular axiom in the recovery community and for Christianity for that matter, and it's this: let go and let God, which is just another way of saying be still. Trust God. He's going to fight for you. That's where our journey to freedom, our redemption begins. And we're going to be looking more at that next week, so I'd invite you to bring a friend and come on back. But I want you to know that if you're here this morning and you feel like you're up against it, and circumstances in your life have you doubting God or questioning God, you're in the right place. And we've got an awesome team of people at the back of this church that would be more than willing, would love to sit down and talk with you more. Pray with you. You can take a friend with you. They're just at the back of the room by the prayer sign. And I'd encourage you, take advantage of that. But we as a community, we want to walk with you through whatever it is you're going through. I'm so glad you're here journeying with us. So grab a friend, come back, and we'll see you here next week. Let's pray. God, we love stories of redemption, especially when that story is about us. And we thank you that you are writing each of us into your story. And your dream for us is to bring it that freedom that we're all longing for, looking for, striving for. But sometimes circumstances can make it seem like you're not even listening to us. That our prayers are just bouncing off the ceiling right back down. But we can see through this story, you're always at work, authoring in our story, working us into the story. Help us to see that. Help us to trust you and to be still. Thank you for loving us, and we pray this in your name. Amen.